Well, we're now in the second session on Lebanon and Sudan, and these are very interesting case studies that come out part of the context of what the ERF has been doing on stabilization and sustainable policies in the MENA region. If I may, just before I introduce these speakers, may I simply have a few...
Samir في إسحاق هيقدم لبنان.
Yeah, I know.
في two papers.
Yes.
20 minutes for Sudan,
Yeah.
followed by 20 minutes for Lebanon.
Yes, yes.
And then we have two commentators.
Okay, okay. The two multi-authored papers, respectively, on Sudan and Lebanon to be presented in this session are rich, very rich in content and far-reaching in their policy recommendations to achieve sustainable growth. And of course, we look forward to the authors and the commentators have to say in this regard. Unfortunately, both countries, Sudan is currently suffering from armed civil conflict, while Lebanon is yet to begin addressing its catastrophic financial crisis that broke out in late 2019. Hopefully, it will not be long before both countries begin their recovery process. On Sudan, I can only wait to listen to what Ibrahim has to say. On Lebanon, the paper comes out with a number of assertions that I would have liked to discuss with the authors, but as chair of the session, I will refrain from doing so. However, I do wish to draw attention to one assertion with which I agree, namely, that the cause of Lebanon's ultimate collapse is not its liberal economic system, but rather it's been hijacked by an oligarchy and cartels made possible by the failure of the state in its role of as regulator, particularly, I would add, in the post-war period. The political dimension of economic reform, as the paper mentions, should be given its proper due. I have two questions to the authors of this paper, to Ishac in particular. If time allows, I would appreciate a response to them. The first question, what, in your opinion, explains the ability of Lebanon's generally long ruling elite to survive, if not even benefit, from the country's financial and economic disaster that erupted in 2019, and for which they are primarily responsible? My second question is, in dealing with the issue of public debt, I think protecting already frozen bank deposits should be a priority of any planned recovery. Otherwise, with or without banking reform, I think Lebanese banks may no longer be able to attract savings either locally or from abroad. If this is the case, then what should the authorities do? What path should they take to determine a repayment schedule over a number of years? Should haircuts be considered as part of the plan? And if successful, once a debt recovery is adopted, can we assume a totally free foreign exchange market along with the elimination of the Lebanese financial intervention, so-called Lebanese financial invention, the so-called dollar? Would this go away? These are two questions I hope Ishac might consider replying to. Thank you, Ishac. Now we have two speakers, Ibrahim on Sudan, and I need not introduce Ibrahim as our managing director, and of course Ishac is also very well known to us. He's director of research, finance for development, lab, School of Economics, and we have two commentators. We have first Hamid Eltigani, who is in the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies, the dean, in fact, the School of Economics and Economics Administration and Public Policy at the Doha Institute. And then finally, we have Bassem Sneige, who is with Sciences Po, if I'm not mistaken. So without further ado, Ibrahim, would you care to start?
Okay, so this is a paper especially given the recent unfortunate development. It has to be about also post-conflict reconstruction, but mainly, of course, the program, the project focuses on stabilization and growth agenda. This is a jointly authored paper by 6 colleagues. But Amir and I will be presenting on behalf of our colleague. One of our colleagues is Dr. Kabashi Suleiman, is actually trapped in a very difficult area in Sudan, so we pray for his safety. The outline is we start by understanding the context and what we call or characterize as a de facto sudden stops, because that sudden stops actually has a lot to do with economic collapse and then the eventual end game of the former regime after the secession of South Sudan and the creation of the Republic of South Sudan, and more than 75% of the oil revenues were lost to the economy of Northern Sudan and of course the Republic of Sudan. The policy framework for re-engagement and economic relief, of course, after what we call in Sudan the December Revolution in December 2018, which eventually led to the collapse of the former what we call in Sudan Inghaz regime, which is what they call their name, that they came to rescue the country. And then, of course, the political economy of growth. And here I would like to take a comparison between Sudan and Ethiopia. There's so many things in common between the two countries. Both countries are very difficult to govern. It's highly polarized societies and faced with so many difficulties. Sudan is much richer, much more endowed than Ethiopia, but nonetheless, it is good to explore the political economy from the lens of the two elites that govern the two countries over the last 30 years or so. And we undertake a gross accounting and simulation model using the World Bank long-term growth model, which is really a very interesting kind of accessible model to ask the question about if we are assuming that we need to ignite growth, as the report has told us, the regional report, how much investment we need and how to finance this investment. How to finance this investment is provided in the paper by the agro-industrial growth corridors, in view of the tremendous potential of Sudan as a breadbasket country for the region. So there is already actually, after the war in Ukraine, a discussion in some institutions in the Arab world about the potential role of Sudan in providing, covering the food deficit and relocalizing the supply chain and the value chain for the Arab world and for Africa. Unfortunately, Sudan and this paper as well also had to deal with conflict, peace building, and reconstruction in view of the current tragic situations, which is not fully covered by the paper, but hopefully we could cover that. So understanding the context and the sudden stops and the economic collapse, it's very telling actually to show the outpouring of the Sudanese people for so many long months, yet the regime was unable to reform itself and to recover. In terms of understanding the context, the first thing that comes to mind is that the collapse of the export capacity. As you can see, the total export of Sudan before 2011 was mainly powered by oil exports. But then immediately you could see the extreme collapse that happened. And the reason being was because during the oil era, the regime never really, made an effort to diversify the economy and to use the oil proceeds in order to capitalize the agricultural sector. And that's why you could see the effect here. And of course, the petroleum, this dotted line, as a result of the secession of the South, starting 2012, and then also the somewhat, less severe, but also the decline in, that the gold sector, which started to become important, especially after the secession of the South, could not really cover compensate for the collapse. And here you will see, and here you will see that the economy itself collapsed and never recovered starting 2012, these bar charts. And also the imports, so both the imports and the as I said, we characterize the crisis as a de facto sudden stops, and sudden stops, of course, is a very important literature in the context of Latin America and other emerging countries in the 90s, and particularly the research by Guillermo Calvo and his research associates, that actually once capital flows reverse as a result of better news by investors or suspicion that something wrong is associated with the country that they thought they could partake into its takeoff, and so a lot of capital flows come in. Then capital outflows create a huge crisis, and what we did was actually split the oil exports that originates from the south, which is the red dotted line. And you can see that actually if you think of it as transfers or capital flows, you could see that it's really a very severe sudden stop. There is nothing sudden about it because the government of the former regime should have anticipated it, but they never really cared. And so it actually created the effect of a sudden stop. And so once that happened, then the current account has to adjust. And you can see that if we actually adjust the current account by netting out the oil export from the south, you could see that actually this picture looks very much, if you look at some of the papers by Calvo and his colleagues on Argentina, for example, that actually the current account adjustment in Argentina looks very similar to this in the 90s as a result of the sudden stops. So this is really the phenomena. And what happened was that you can see that actually, let me back up, you can see that actually the imports did not really collapse as you would expect. It actually only slightly declined after 2011 and then recovered. The reason being is because of this, that the remittances from the Sudanese working abroad picked up quite considerably, this total dotted line. And you can see that actually the official remittances, the thick blue lines, declined considerably over time, but then the light blue lines actually increased significantly, and these are the remittances transacted through the parallel market. And then at the same time, the parallel market premium increased quite precipitously, the continuous line. And so this is what could be characterized as the parallel market premium, or the parallel market basically controlling or influencing the economy, that the official exchange rate and the official market for foreign exchange was basically a sideshow. So The question is why the Inghaz regime failed to respond until its eventual demise in April 2019. Deficit financing and macroeconomic populism was adopted despite the crisis. Hyperinflation, fuel subsidy accounted for 1/3 of the budget. Parallel market for foreign exchange, as I said, ran supreme. So the question, important political economic question, why the regime failed to reform? The regime failed to reform because the regime was a very well entrenched kleptocracy. And it was very nicely characterized by Alex Diwan and his colleagues that the political marketplace was really the market where the oil revenues was distributed to those institutions and those constituencies that have the capacity to project violence, including the official institutions like the army, but also a host of paramilitary institutions, including, of course, what we call in Arabic al-Da'm al-Sari', the Rapid Support Force. And then the kleptocracy moved from centralized political marketplace to oligopolistic or collusive oligopoly political marketplace, using gold and whatever resources they could get from the Arab countries in the Gulf. This is a chronology about the reform process, which I will not speak about. It's well known. It's been negotiated, obviously, after the revolution with the IMF and the World Bank. And it was actually on course to achieve its objective in terms of re-engagement and in terms of the unification of the exchange rate that's already happened, and in terms of the transition from commodity subsidies to directly supporting Sudanese people through the family support program. And of course, we have some colleagues here in the audience, Hafiz Ghanim and others who are actually, participated in this and contributed to the reform in Sudan. But unfortunately, the coup that took place in the 25th of October basically derailed this process. So just wanted to say that the necessary shift in focus now has to be urgent post-conflict reconstruction support, moving fiscal policy and structural reform from austerity to growth, and visible progress on the urgent timeline to create political support. These are new issues that I think need to be taken into account. But, Sudan is a hippie country. It was in course and everything. So the rest is standard, so I don't want, for the interest of time, to belabor this point. So the political economy, as I mentioned already, it's for Sudan to understand, it's an interesting tale of two countries. You can see that on the left side, is an index of GDP, real GDP. And you can see that Sudan, the thick line, was stagnating despite the oil resources and what have you, while Ethiopia, actually, the Ethiopian economy grew by about 4 times in 15 years, between 2004 to 2015, or 19 years. And at the beginning of the period, Ethiopia was abjectly poor. The GDP of Ethiopia was about 20 billion. Sudan was about 80 billion. But by the end of the 15 years or 19 years, actually Ethiopia closed the gap, while Sudan stagnated. The same story could be told for income per capita. So the question is, I was very inspired by a recent book by Stephen Derkun, where he argues that even though conditions could be very bad, like in Ethiopia and Sudan, highly polarized societies and lots of civil wars and problems, but still, elites sometimes might choose development, and in other cases, they might choose kleptocracy. So the basis of the emergence of the states is the agreement of the elites to share the rent available under the existing power, no matter how small that rent. Few elites bet on development by sacrificing available rents for future growth, but there is no recipe. They are general principles. That is why it is betting on the future. It is, and so why take the risk? Why some elites take the risk? Maybe access to power after severe crisis like a civil war, that may be a factor. Or perhaps what happened to the Chinese Communist Party after the disastrous Cultural Revolution and the rise of Deng Xiaoping. Or maybe ability to some elites who are sophisticated enough to learn and to self-correct. Meles Zenawi, actually, for the first 10 years in Ethiopia, he was following the Albanian style of Marxism. But then, you know, knowledge perhaps allowed them to do that. The regime in Ethiopia, under Meles Zenawi, they adopted economic legitimacy as a basis for the regime's survival. They focus on developmental federalism, and they actually executed a project that focuses on agriculture, food security, infrastructure and energy, and a special economic zone. Nonetheless, the civil war in Ethiopia showed that in highly polarized societies, benevolent authoritarianism is not really sustainable. The case of Sudan is an outright, of course, kleptocracy, adopting empowerment as a basis for the regime's survival, which we call in Sudan tamkeen. So they basically allowed the members of the Islamic Front, so-called Islamic Front, to basically control the state. In the first year, in 1989, they fired almost 80% of the army and the security services and created a new army, ideological army. Tribal clientelism in the states. The project is that the disappearance of oil and the survival of the rentier approach is that they move to the gold and other instruments for raising rents. Lessons, of course, is to avoid reproducing the Engas system in a socially diverse society like Sudan. As I said, we use the LTGM, long-term growth model. Our argument is that this is an appropriate model for Sudan because Sudan is basically supply constraint rather than demand constraint. So we have three equations. One of them is a standard growth drivers equation. The other one is solving this in order to derive the investment ratio that is required to produce a given level of growth. And then the last one, of course, is just financing the investment, either through domestic saving or foreign direct investment or change in debt. Unfortunately, this part is a casualty of the current situation in Sudan because our colleague Kabashi is the main author of this component, and he is trapped in Sudan, and we could not communicate with him to get him to give us the more recent one. So I just show very briefly that assuming other technical conditions, productivity is very critical for avoiding exorbitant and unrealistic investment ratios in order to produce a per capita income growth of about 4%. That's what we assumed. So, Mr. Chairman, I finished, but I wanted my colleague for 5 minutes, if possible, to speak about the agricultural corridors.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. So in the ERF agriculture paper about Sudan, we recommended agro-industries corridors as a development strategy for sustainable growth, as well as for poverty reduction and food security. So, so in the paper, we recommended 14 growth corridors. We detailed for each one the strengths of each area, and also the industries that are associated with each one of them. So we have, depending on the area and the crops that's being produced. So we have textile, we have meat industries, we have gum Arabic processing, oil processing. So a long list of industries so that we can move from exporting raw materials to value-added industries. So in order for this strategy to succeed, it must have infrastructural support. So, and that's where our real challenge is. So moving forward, I don't know if you can see it, but the red line here, that's pretty much mimics our road infrastructure. So looking at that, despite that there was a heavy investment from the previous government since the early 2000s on roads, we have 11,800 kilometers of road. 50% of them, they require rehabilitation. Moreover, the emphasis was in the interstate roads, while the interstates, and that's where, like, we have large areas, these roads are only paved roads. So there was no investment in that, and that impacts the supply chain tremendously. When we looked also, we found out these areas, the blue areas, these are new proposed roads because they are critical for connecting the productive cities. Also, another point is the border terminals. So we have border terminals with Egypt, with Chad, with South Sudan, with Ethiopia. Now that Argin and Wadi Halfa, they're coming, they're playing a big role in this crisis. So these terminal borders are just like basic. They have very low services and they require major upgrade. So moving forward, these are airports. We have quite a number of airports. Basically, most of the growth corridors, but they do not meet the minimum standards. Our national carrier requires reconstruction. Ports, we have 5 ports, 5 specialized ports on the Red Sea. One for, you all know Port Sudan, export, import. We have another Al Khair port. This is for petroleum exports. We have another one for animal stock exports. But again, all of them, they require basically storage capacity increases, new systems for management of the ports. We need to increase the metric tons that's being moved. So, and then we come to energy. We have been in discussion about energy in the earlier session. 96% of our energy comes from hydro and fossil fuel. We produced in 2022 4.4 gigawatt of energy, and this by no means will suffice what we want to do in terms of industrialization or even expansion in agriculture. Having said that, there have been good experiences in clean energy. There are 3 wind farms, one in the north of Sudan, in Dongola, one in, on the Red Sea, and one on the west of Sudan. We have El Shamal plant that produces 54 megawatt of solar power. Another 5 megawatt in Al Fasher, another 2 megawatt in Al Janina. So we propose the one in orange. These are what we are proposing, that we complement the basically the grid, which has insufficient capacity, with solar power. There's a project of around 1,000 solar pumps that is underway and distributed among the different farms in Sudan. The last segment is telecommunication, which I think this is a bright spot of our infrastructure. We do have 35 million mobile subscribers. We have 8.5 broadband subscribers. We have 15,000 kilometers of fiber optic, and we have expansion, two-segment expansion. We are connected to Eastern African submarine system as a gateway, and also with flag. We also have, Sudan has launched a satellite in 2019 in cooperation with China as for civilian and military, quote unquote, purposes. And of course, we have to start preparing for 5G to take advantage of the bandwidth capacity, network slicing, and edge computing. So major investment is required in the infrastructure in order to be able to execute our policy. Last slide, Mr. Muggs. So financing of the agro corridor. Basically, the corridor is a partnership between public actors and private sector. And that's where we will have the public actors pay for the infrastructure, and the private sector, they will pay for the operating cost, and will also act like a board member for the gross corridors. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry I didn't introduce you because your name didn't appear in the program, but it's okay. That's all right. Ishac. $15 is hot.
Thank you.
If it's hot, 15 minutes.
Okay. Lebanon in 15 minutes. This is difficult. It's a difficult country.
I don't mind if they wait later on to go take half an hour.
No. I'll take 15 minutes. So, yeah, I mean, you need to, this was very interesting, but you need to blank your mind to jump to a totally different situation. The Lebanon debt crisis. Thank you. So how do I... we had the main goal of this paper was to bring the facts together. Okay, thank you. That explain the rise of the crisis in Lebanon over the past 2 decades, and then try to understand what happened after the crisis, after 2019. Really for 2 audiences, the Lebanese audience, because in Lebanon we mostly write op-eds and little notes, so we wanted to bring kind of all this body of knowledge together around a data set that is coherent. But also, you know, our audience here, you know, what lessons can we draw from Lebanon, the PEG in Jordan, the mismanagement of the fiscal account for other countries. Maybe I'll cover just the 2 first points here, so I'll answer Samir only in part. What's interesting, one interesting aspect of the Lebanese situation is that there are several different narratives. You know, there is a political narrative, which is Rafiq Hariri, big bet to reconstruct Lebanon after the war, to become the next Dubai, but then the peace process falters in the region and the bet fails. Then he's assassinated, and basically the country stays on the same path with no strong leadership to develop another engine for growth. So at some point the model collapses. There is another narrative about the public sector borrowing too much money, mismanaging, stealing, lots of money flowing into the banks lend to the state overspent, and at some point no return on this, so that the Ponzi will have to explode. There is another narrative which is less common but more precise, which is not just the state that overborrowed. Actually, a lot of the deficit was of the private sector, of households. They also overborrowed, and the economy didn't grow. And I'll show you some evidence on this. And then a more precise statement, which is that the problem really comes from the pegged exchange rates, therefore Jordan, which over time led to an appreciated currency, which weakened growth, but also made imports cheaper, and led to a very large current account, which ultimately had to blow up, causing a lot of losses before. I mean, defending the peg too far, not just with all the reserves of the central bank, but also with the money of the depositors. Maybe it's starting to happen in other countries. And after, the balance sheet of the central bank was so much distorted, short on dollars, longs on pound, that once the devaluation came, the losses were enormous, and they led to a financial crisis as well. So there are, all these different layers of stories which we try to illustrate in the paper, to document. Now, it's not a political economy paper on purpose, because we think to do political economy, you need to understand the economics. But broadly, the paper assumes that the irrationality, if you like, of the situation of going slowly into a wall, and then when you get into the crisis, mismanaging the crisis, broadly has to do with power sharing. Too many forces together with lots of veto players that have to do with a very tough economic political situation. Hariri assassination in 2005, Israeli invasion, later the Syrian war, and here we have the Intifada and the Beirut port explosion. And part of your answer, why we fall from very high to very low is during all these difficult moments, there was support by the international community to pass difficult moments. So we had repeated bailouts. This is the growth rate. You see, we have high growth during the 90s, during the reconstruction phase, and then it falls because we get into high debt, basically high interest rates. Then the growth rises again around the global financial crisis, because Lebanon becomes seen as a safe haven, then falls again with the Syrian crisis close to zero. So, various conferences to shore up Lebanon. And then in 2016, the most important financial support, which is the Saudi guarantee that Lebanon will not fail, goes away when they imprison Saad Hariri and they disengage from Lebanon. So the real crisis starts, or at least is exacerbated here, and then we get into finally a bank run. So this is I wanted to say here, it's also a difficult security situation, and we should not forget that we had no major insecurity in Lebanon. So these coalition governments at least managed to keep the place secure, even though they were fighting next door in Syria, the same protagonists. But this very broad alliance could not make the kind of decisions, courageous economic decisions. So broadly, we have three phases. You see, these are the debt ratios. Coming into the end of the 90s, the failure of the peace process, they're very high, and they keep going up. And then after Hariri's assassination, they come down. Partly when you were minister, taxes are increased, we're producing primary surpluses, there's some growth. And then after the Syrian crisis, no growth, high interest rates. Whoops, what's happening here? So broadly, three phases. The phase after the reconstruction, which is a difficult phase, Lebanon is very fragile. It could have, the financial crisis could have exploded here, but it's saved by the donors with international conferences, Paris 1 and 2, interest rate fall and the like. A second phase with tight fiscal management. That's your period, I think. And then an inflow of money after the global financial crisis, where the debt ratios fall, and then after the civil war they rise again and then they explode. This is interesting. It shows you the current account deficits in hard red. So that's one specificity of Lebanon. They are very high. You know, the average is 20% of GDP over the period. That's about $10 billion coming in every year. So there's a flow of dollars coming in. Financing what? This broken red line is the fiscal deficit. So you see they're financing the fiscal deficit, which falls over time. And then after that, they're financing the private sector deficit. So that debunks the first story. That is, it's not just a fiscal story. It's really more of a Dutch disease type story where the exchange rate is overvalued. This is on the dynamics of public debt. In little blue here, you have the primary deficit, which becomes very small and the primary surplus. So it's not that that's driving the debt ratio that's rising over time. This is 2010. Rather, it is the fact that the green line, the interest rate, is much higher than the growth rate. So we get over time to a situation where there's no growth. Depositors that are bringing money from abroad are more and more uncomfortable. The central bank has to raise interest rate to keep attracting the money, to finance the deficit, to keep the peg fixed, and until it blows up because the debt ratio keeps rising. That's about the real economy. It's not the best of graphs. I'll do something better, but it basically shows you that it's basically a Dutch disease graph. The orange line is the performance of exports. Exports are coming down over time because the currency is becoming overvalued, but also Syria closes down and many of the routes to the Gulf go through Syria. The blue line here is investment, the evolution of investment. Investment is also coming down over the period as interest rates become higher. So, you know, the economy deteriorates as the exchange rate becomes more appreciated. And we can calculate that the real exchange rate becomes about 45%. I think that was the IMF calculation, overvalued. This is the evolution of interest rate. If you look at the bold one, this is the spread of deposits in dollars over the US dollar interest rate. So when you deposited in Lebanon in dollars, you could make 4% more than this in the United States. So that shows that the risks, and this one is the Lebanese pound. So initially the risk was very much a perception of the pound could devalue, but over time it was more the fact that the state could default. So you needed, you know, on dollars a premium of up to 4%. And of course you could calculate that this has added tens of billions of dollars to the debt, and basically the peg is not working. The reason you have a peg is to keep interest rates down. One complexity of Lebanon is that the balance sheets of the state, the banks, and the central bank are very much connected. You know, money comes into bank accounts. The banks, mistrusting the state, deposit those dollars at the central bank, which then lends in part in pounds to the state, and in part defends the peg. So they have losses in two ways. One is the cost of carry. So here you see these are the deposits of banks into the central bank. And here in brown are the reserves of the central bank. You see the reserves are about stable, even though the deposit increase over time, because the central bank is losing a part. You know, they are taking these deposits at 10% and investing them in London at 0. So there's a cost of carry. But there is also reserves that are going into paying for the balance of payment deficits. So you're losing reserves over time as well. And the red line here is the net position in foreign exchange of the central bank. You see, already in 2016, it turns negative. So by 2016, the net position of the central bank is more and more negative, which means it's defending the peg with the money of others. It's run out of reserve already, and it's defending the peg with the money of depositors. You could also see here, this is the balance sheet of the central bank. On the liability side, deposits, so the balance sheet grows enormously as it takes more and more deposits from banks. So 78% of its assets are bank deposits. And what does it do with this money? It has dollar assets, but the ratio is shrinking. And the ratio of Lebanese assets, CDs, to the government is rising. So they're basically dollarizing domestic debts. We thought it was in domestic currency and therefore it could be deflated, but it's more and more sits with the central bank, which take deposits in dollars, so it gets effectively dollarized. And that's what would lead after the devaluation to huge losses in the central bank, now estimated about $60 billion. And this is the position of commercial banks. Green is deposit at the central bank, and this is loans to the government. You see, they increasingly replace loans to the government by deposits at the central bank, and these are loans to the private sector. They shrink over time. So what happened in 2019 is a sudden stop, like in Sudan, but now it leads to a triple crisis because of the way these balance sheets are together. First, the current account deficit, 20% of GDP, cannot be financed anymore, so imports have to be curtailed from like 15 billion to 3-4 billion, I'll show you. There's a banking crisis, because there is a run on the banks, since all their assets are in government debt, which has lost all its value. And there is a debt crisis. The government is insolvent, cannot borrow anymore. And so you have a fiscal crisis, and you will see now the government has to print money in order to pay for salaries. And so in the paper, we ask, why does GDP fall so much? I'll show you that GDP collapses in unseen ways. What happens to the state? Did the economy hit rock bottom or not, we ask. And then the issue of how to share the losses is the big issue in Lebanon. It's a political issue, very hard to resolve. There are humongous losses, 3 times larger than GDP, and how to distribute them in the population is the question. This is interesting. It's the structure of deposits. Deposits smaller than 1.5 million, larger than 1.5 million in the banking sector. And you see end 2018 and 2019, big drop, 10%, 10 billion, sorry. At the end of the crisis comes when there is a run by depositors, not by banks. You know, banks are making huge profits, lending at very high interest rate to the central bank. There are just a few of them. They're coordinated. They take their profits abroad. So they are not the ones that blow out the system at the end. It's depositors, and it's the very large depositors. So we lose $10 billion here and some more here. But that's another story. Okay, sorry for all these numbers. This is GDP. 100 in 2018, this is the index, and it falls in 2022 to 67 in real Lebanese pound when you account for inflation. But inflation, of course, is very hard to measure because it's over 100% per year. And it falls to 38 at the dollar exchange rate. So the real fall is somewhere in between. Obviously, there is an over-depreciation, an overshooting of the currency, so that's an exaggeration, but that's probably not right either because inflation is mismeasured, somewhere in between. So it means that GDP has fallen by somewhere between 40 and 60%, which is enormous for a country not at war. I think Ukraine has fallen by 25% so far. So why? Now, remember, total spending must have fallen because 20 were coming from abroad and stopped coming, the sudden stop. So you would think, you know, spending will be cut by 20. Actually, it's cut by much more. And the reason is that GDP, the production collapses as well. Production collapses because the banks close down. There's no more credit. The electricity company is down. There's no electricity. The port blows up later. So, I mean, it's very hard to do business. So production doesn't turn from domestic demand to export. Actually, exports collapse, even though the exchange rate is, you know, many, many times lower than before. Export go from 100 to 30. So everything collapses. And look at the governments, from 100 to somewhere between 9 and 15. So from a budget of $10 billion to less than $1 billion now. So when, of course, investment also. So, you know, when we think of recovery, there's a problem of rebuilding the financial sector, but it's also the problem of rebuilding the state. You cannot really have a country without a state or with a state that's at 5% of GDP, for GDP that's so much lower than it was before. So it's complicated to think about a recovery. This is the external account, and I want to show you here several things. This is the current account deficit, used to be around 10 billion, these are billions of dollars, and look how it adjusts with the crisis to about 3 billion. So imports are enormously compressed, and that, of course, is very, creates a big recession in a country that lives on imports. Small country transforms imports. The capital account, that's the sudden stop, you know, from 17 billion coming in every year, we have a negative. Now, what's interesting and sad is the use of reserves. You know, the central bank starts the crisis with $35 billion of reserve. Now it has 10 billion. Where did the difference go? It's partly subsidizing imports, but it's partly capital flight. You could see here that in 2020, $13 billion of reserve were spent. You know, about as much as during a good year, how much came naturally. But what was it spent on? Partly to finance the current account deficit, but which shrunk enormously, and mostly to finance unrecorded inflows, which were outflows, capital flight of the connected people. There was no law on capital control, so banks did whatever they wanted. And nearly 9 billion of reserve, and then nearly 4 were lost to capital controls, to capital flight, sorry, which exacerbated the crisis, of course. This is kind of a balance sheet of what we can call Lebanon Inc. You asked me about, I'm done, I think. So if you look at all the assets of the consolidated state, central bank, and banks, and their liabilities, they're basically $115 billion of deposits. And if you add all the assets, the gold, the reserves, the private sector loans, and even the state assets, you get at most 65 billion. So it means the haircut should be about 50%, even after bank shareholders lose all their assets if they ever accept that. And so it's, it's a tough situation on depositors as well. So if we were to talk about the future, I'll talk about stabilization and recovery. Right now, the focus is on social protection and humanitarian aid, basically. The IMF have left pre-board conditions basically on how to rebuild the financial sector, but it is stuck because of the difficulty of distributing the losses that I showed you before. And then the states, the IMF, I mean, nobody has a good notion of how you can rebuild the state from such a low base. Right now, the political complexities of Lebanon are focused on how to elect a president before we could start thinking about all these things. So maybe I'll stop here.
It's written by the best, and of course Dr. Ibrahim and his team those are the leading economists in Sudan. So when they write it, you know, people will read that paper, and also they'll come out with also critical thought, which is very important in our discussions. Once we talk about the post-conflict, of course, in the case of Sudan is all about conflict. The country for 60 years and more is in the sequence of the conflict. So the paper is valid and the title is valid, and hopefully we're just hoping that this will be the last conflict this country will going through it. Regarding the yes, okay, good, okay. So yeah, right. Yeah. Okay, good. The idea of the post-conflict stabilization and growth. This country is, for example, reconstruction means is a development. Okay, we need to have a really serious development, and this is far important than the narrow prescription of the World Bank and IMF that they are just looking for the growth driven dividends. So the authors have addressed 4 questions. And this is one of the weakness of the paper and the strength of the paper as well. 4 research questions in one paper is too many already. One of them is just they're moving on to the economic crisis and the Inga's role. And basically they are explaining about the institutional and political economy. And if you look at the Ingas itself, also one of the contextual things, this for 30 years, the regime is in a continuous conflict, continuous war, whether in Darfur, whether with the Southern Sudan, and etc. So that those creating dynamics that has become a war economy. And the war is sucking so much of resources that ought to be reflected, because I was just saying in Darfur alone, the calculation is about direct and indirect cost of the conflict is around $50 billion. So that's a huge amount of money for a country like Sudan. And Sudan is a very rich country, unfortunately, a very rich country. That's why they're able to sustain for 30 years. The regime is able to sustain its effect. Of course, when the oil come in, it creates a new dynamics, and they talk about the sudden stops, and that's a very, very important. But also I could believe that is not only the sudden stop is the reason that the regime is collapsed. I think for the 30 years, the generation who are running the Enghaz regime, they become very bored, they become very aging, they lost energy, they lost interest. A person telling me that is, in the last 5 years, when you go to the President al-Bashir, he will just speak about jokes. He doesn't like to talk about any serious issue. So that's when the ruler become ruling country becomes so monotonous and boring. That's the beginning of an end by itself, and that created a lot of friction inside, contributing for the demise of the regime. So we can attribute it to the economic collapse that has it has contributed. That's true, but if the regime has energy and they have a vibrant, they could start. There's so many countries that are ruled by the autocrat that are oppressed, and people can become subdued. So that's one thing. The paper also discuss about the transitional government economic reform agenda. Of course, those are Dr. Ibrahim, his own. That's his serious contribution to that one, and he set the stage, and it created windows of opportunity. But unfortunately, there was a chaos that was driven by, I call it the economic thugs, means somebody that is pretending to be an economist but never economist, and they are saying the whole country is very rich. Why you want to remove the subsidies? Country is very rich, and then they drive Dr. Ibrahim to that corridors of conversation, And that conversation is a populist conversation that you can win it. But that's require an honest debate regarding that. Of course, the COVID is another aspect of it. The government spent a lot of money to just make it, to maintain the life. And there was little economic activities. For the targeting subsidies, I thought that was a very nice equation that they brought it up, what's called the dividend, thamarat, to subsidizing the families, targeting family rather than targeting everybody. The amount is smaller, but symbolically it is just freeing an opportunity for the government to start investing more. For the comparison, there is some sort of comparison between economic growth comparison between Sudan and Ethiopia. It is true that those countries are all coming out of wars. But comparing those two countries, I think a little bit we are stretching our imagination, because one country come out of the war and they become very stabilized. Okay? They are not democratic. Of course, they are very, you call it social planner or benign ruler. Probably very autocratic, but he's going to push you to achieve certain goals. And for that reason, he never created a system of governing that is accommodating everyone, but he able to succeed. And that's why, after his demise, after he's gone, the system collapsed again, and they went back to war, and then undo all those gains. So the target over there is economic development. Clearly, they put on objectives for economic development. They become a benign dictator that he has an objective, but in Sudan it's a bit different. They have random objective every other time, circumstantial objectives, and it's always random objective, and that's why we could not achieve so much about so much of progress. For the other ones is about the agro-business and cluster business. Of course, Sudan is no matter, not oil, not gold. I think our future is in agriculture, and having agro-business, creating industrial clusters. This is very good because you are taking advantage of the local resources, as well as you are creating an opportunity for other industry around that industry to grow. It's not about that old forward, backward linkages, no, rather than industrial cluster. So the idea of the cluster is good, but also once you look at the map, because there is the northern part, there's a lot of desert. And on the desert, they are saying that is probably opportunity cost of making clusters over there is a problematic, but the other things also, you are creating infrastructure extending to the other areas. And little bit on Chad, and you're going to Libya, because those clusters, those are areas that you can export the agricultural product to the neighboring countries, to Libya, to Chad. So those clusters ought to be making over there. Also livestock, so much livestock in the north. Otherwise, you see that people are going to be migrating to the south again and creating a lot of pressure on those infrastructure over there that is driven the conflict. The other thing, those are the, of course, those are the research findings. And the other thing for the sudden stop. It is sudden stop because the government, we know that the south is going to be separated. This doesn't need a brainer. Why the government is not acting it? Another thing is institutional rigidity is there, okay? The institutional rigidity is key, that the government has no flexibility to move things around, okay? And that could be one of the, because people have expectations, and those expectations already taken an effect, but the institutions are not flexible enough to accommodate those changes and bring alternative. So everybody was in a steady state until that collapse has happened. The kleptocracy is a synonym. This is about the kleptocracy, about the asset recovery. Also, I believe that in Sudan we are exaggerating the asset that has been stolen. Okay, they are saying that is, some people saying that 200 billion, other people saying that it's about 70 billion. But the whole oil receipt itself, if they stolen all of it, is around $67 billion. So where are you going to get the other money? Okay, And don't forget that is also the country needs to spend on fuels, on subsidies, and spending for the military. So I'm just, my roughness, if this money is around 7 billion, that's a lot of money. Not 67. So the effort of the asset recovery, it's become political lynching, and rather than becoming something that is systematically being done through the legal processes and etc. Just amateur come there and say, oh, we're going to bring the assets. And then they go there and confiscated people's house or his farms. And they said, you know, this is looted. And those are not going to be, everybody know that these are not going to stand in front of the court of law. So those are a little bit of a thing that are distraction. People spend a lot of time. Just this is the last slide. For the research, just my suggestion is, of course, I know this ongoing research, and it's beautifully written, but I would see that those 4 questions are too many to be put in one article. Either you're going to make a book or edited book that is make it give a sufficient time and space for everyone to become a book and add some other chapters. That could be one way or another, or series of articles. Also for the agro-business, need to be linked very precisely to this conversation. Why the agro-business is not other sectors are not there. So that needs to be motivated to be linked with the existing conversation. Also, the literature review section are a little bit poor. Okay, so I feel that is for the sudden stop. There is so much debate on that one. Need to be bring it into the conversation. Reconstruction need to be bring it into the conversation. 1 minute. And the last one is also the paper need to be toned it down. Okay, tone it down, because there is some word that was over there make the paper is weaken the paper, because people feeling like this is probably some sort of a propaganda that is you put it on. So like the word callously pursued, kleptocratic economy, the disdain, thankful, visionary unionist. I never seen visionary unionist, because if they are visionary, we never separate the country. But there are all political gimmicks there. And the other things like thanks and the supreme. So those are just need to be weeded out. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Hamid. Very interesting.
Okay, so I don't need this. No. So I'm going to have to make comments on a paper written by Top Guns, which makes it very hard. I'm not an academic by background. I'm an investment banker and trader by background, and coming to this in the last few years. So I'm not going to make academic comments, but I'm going to use rather the same method as the paper, as on an asset and liability type of assessment of the paper. And I think that, you know, it's started with the core comment, which is there can be no country without security and a working state. A sentence that can be probably used for all our presentations and workshops across all the region, and maybe further than that. So on the asset side, I think the paper contains very important statements that can be used in other crises, putting the core of the cause of the collapse, not so much on individual bad people, doesn't mean that there aren't any, but on the systematic overconsumption generating accumulation of debt that was hidden by a peg. And that pressure cooker accumulated pressure for a very long time, and when it blew up, it multiplied the damage. The paper describes in a very eloquent way the Dutch disease effect that is at the core of the crisis. That allows using the national accounts, which is a very numbers-based methodology, to actually tell the story without leaving too much room for mazaj or opinions that are ideological. So the financial engineering, for example, that was described in 2016, using the national accounts and the balance of payments, is a very surgical description of how and why it happened. One could even think that the central banker was actually doing his job by responding to a non-decision by the political force to not devaluate. So if the political forces they want to devaluate, what's the central banker's job? To continue on with the system and find solutions, right? I'm not saying that person is good or bad or innocent or not, but objectively speaking, there was no decision on breaking the peg. That's another area of the discussion. The tables of money supply and inflation describe also in a very nice way how the pressure was building. And these are numbers that have been, as Ishac said, gathered around into a systematic storytelling that allows to understand the dynamic of the crisis beyond the visible effects, the underlying economic system that sustain them. It contains some of the gems that I found was the very good pages on economic history and how the sustained presence of the banking sector at the center of the Lebanese economy is actually not new. One could even trace it back to the 60s, and the prominence of the banks and the banking system in the Lebanese economy is actually built on a non-changing system of financing consumption through decades. And that's how that society lived for a long, long time and ultimately generated a non-productive, high-consuming, non-sustainable level of way of living. Another very important point, given the situation in Lebanon, is the analysis of the paper of the behavior of the donors and the amounts, the price tags that have been elaborated in the papers around this contribution to sustain the model that we've just described. Ishac mentioned Paris 1 and 2. These were pre-crisis. These were moments where the peg should have blown up, but it didn't. So the culprits are not only inside, but they are also those who participated in sustaining and pushing forward the ball and not taking the decision at the right moment because they funded the previous accumulated pressure. Now, on the liability side, or the subjects that we can argue or discuss, in the paper, there is some sort of confusion around diverging interests of political forces, while at the same time showing that there is converging interests of political forces. And by that I mean that many of the political forces tended to vote unanimously on monetary and financial matters and fought on the way they shared the benefits of sustaining the benefits of this model. So the core issue, prominence of the banks, solvency of the banks, PEG, were always converging interests. The prominence of the banks have been in Lebanon for many decades, which means that all political forces and models validated the fact that banking system is at the core of the Lebanese economy, and that its job was to sell what the paper calls the Lebanese brand. And through that sale, bring in fresh money. Today, one could say, and the paper doesn't say it clearly enough, that the Lebanese brand, which is an asset in the past, might be worth zero. And that's the problem. The proposal in the paper about the liberal system failure, which was also a question by Mr. Makdisi at the beginning of the talk, is also something I would rework, because the liberal system did fail. Maybe we should more talk about capitalist system or regulated capitalist systems rather than liberal system, which confuses ideology sometimes, social liberalism and economic liberalism, which in our case has long proven that it is producing high level of externalities that we're not taking into account, but we're paying the price of. Also, the paper proposes formulas to help society cope, and I quote, restore government capacity. But it doesn't say how. And I think that the different items chosen in the paper as pillars of the recovery are exactly the right ones. But I think we should put some price tags on them, and rather than calling them reforms, use them as a framework for a, as said earlier, a recovery program, and put price tags beyond what is given to us or given to the country as this is the IMF's capacity to help produce a recovery program based on the pillars chosen in the paper, and say this is what we need for that reason. And maybe we will get a response saying, okay, if you need that for that reason, we might help, but you need to give us this framework. And we start negotiating. In those pillars, I would add one item that is missing in the paper, which is the Lebanese armed forces. Because within the Lebanese equation, and the paper mentions it by calling it political dominance, it's a polite word for Hezbollah, that problem needs to be solved. Too many irresponsible comments are made around these comments, this problem. Because a lot of people talk, but they have absolutely no idea how to solve the problem. The only way, and that has happened in other countries, and maybe in Sudan, we're facing the consequences or the challenges of solving it. Integration is the must. To do that, you need to agree on a defense strategy. Like all other pillars of infrastructure that were described eloquently in the previous presentation, armed forces are part of the infrastructure, which means that, in my view, we need to add one more pillar, price it, frame it, in order for it to be part of the pillars of recovery. So to conclude, I would say that the paper is one of those definite documents that is either I would like it to be a book expanding the economic history part to understand the present, but the recovery possibility and the framework of a recovery plan should not take account of what are the reasonable possibilities given to us by the international funders, but propose a plan to which we can attract as seed capital, and that's a private equity investor talking, the initial funders, and hopefully the private sector investors would come. Because as a trader, I like to buy low. But if I can buy low something that has a promise, it's great. But the Lebanese pound might have overshot Ishac. But if there is no hope of recovery, it is merely anticipating the continued demise. Thank you.
Very quick question to Dr. Ibrahim and to Ishac, and it's the same question. The papers focus very much on diagnosis and explaining the situation, how it happened. How about the future? What are the alternative scenarios? And I'm asking about your personal opinions as experts, the alternative scenarios. For example, in the case of Sudan, the South is already separated. Should, heavens forbid, something like that, how is this, can this be possibly resolve the different resolutions? Political ones, what kind of economic situation are they going to lead to? The same applies to the case of Lebanon. Very, very nicely analyzed the situation and what's happening. Again, how does the future look like? And is there any possibility for a political unity within Lebanon? Because this is really the core of the problem in Lebanon. This is what started the entire mess. Okay. Is there any possibility for that? What are the alternative scenarios for the future, in your opinion, as a plan? Thank you.
Thank you.
Ibrahim, I have a question for Ibrahim. He and I worked together on Sudan, and one thing that I still do not understand, just trying to understand what happened, is why did the military turn against Hamdok? I mean, he was doing the dirty work for them, cleaning the economy, taking the risks, and moving forward. What triggered the military against Hamdok?
Question regarding the Sudan presentation, and I was wondering on the road network that you've described, and particularly the blue lines, do you have a price tag on that? How much does it cost?
Excuse me, Ibrahim. Excuse me, let me just take other questions as well. I mean, my question to you and is there something common between Sudan and Lebanon? Anything common that one could think about? I would ask Ibrahim and then Ishac to respond.
The question about the price tag will be answered by my colleague, because we do have actually some numbers about how Sudan could actually respond to the need for food security and modernized agriculture. But let me start with Abla's question. I think the idea behind the sudden stops is actually to show, notwithstanding, of course, our respectable lead commentator, really what a kleptocracy can do. Because that was a regime that ruled the country for 30 years and was able to export oil, and the amount give and take is between 80 to 100 billion dollars during this 10 years, which we called in Sudan the oil era. And So the political economy here is very important to highlight. And also that the sudden stop basically suggests specific types of reform, which is macro stabilization centered around fiscal policy, especially restructuring the fiscal policy, and then of course exchange rate unification, because the parallel market was not a sideshow, it was really a major driver of the economy. Then the issue of growth is important, as of course the theme in the whole project, and the role of agriculture in a context of structural transformation is very critical. So actually the paper starts with identifying the context, the political economy that precipitated it, why the regime did not opt for growth but for rent seeking and distribution, and what should be the macroeconomic framework for reform, and the centrality of growth. And in fact, the paper, when it is ready or finished, we will talk also about economic legitimacy, because we have a history of parliamentary democracy in Sudan for more than 70 years or 60 years, but democracy never survived because it was just Westministerian political, electoral competition. And so it is very important to emphasize the importance that the elites, whether authoritarian or democratic, they have to have an economic agenda, developmental economic agenda, to survive, for democracy to survive. And of course, the post-conflict is an afterthought, because originally the paper was not written to address post-conflict. But now I think it is a central issue that we need to deal with, and that's why the comments by Professor Hamid is very well taken. We need to go back to the Copenhagen. In fact, I was one of those who contributed to the Copenhagen consensus, which is an important forum about costing reconstruction and also assessing the cost of war. And Paul Collier was actually the main contributor to that. For Hafiz, I would say that actually it is simply, the answer is provided by Alex Diwan. These people, this military, never really believed that there was a revolution. They just wanted to, to respond to the event of the time and then seize the opportunity to undermine the process, especially exploiting the divisions within the civilian political forces. And also it became very difficult for them to forego, the political marketplace in terms of gold and whatever other things they were doing. For example, as a Minister of Finance, I had very hard time to get the details about the budget of the military. We don't know actually how many, how much is the people, the number of people under arms, because they don't give us, for example, the size of the military. They give us a budget and so on and so forth. So I think it is mainly a political economy that maybe they wanted economic reform at the beginning, but then when it came to the hard institutional, and especially the SMP agreement with the IMF, when I signed this, the initial agreement with the IMF, one of the core items is that the Ministry of Finance will have to have direct supervision and oversight over all the activities of the military. And I think that's what that's what triggered the response. And also, I think I'm sorry to use this word, but the Islamoists, which we call them the Islamoists, why? Because a political party that use Islam as an instrument to promote political agenda. They are actually now the instigators of this conflict. All the evidence suggests that, and they have never really accepted that they were removed from power. And I think all of these are the factors that derailed Sudan from the reform and from political transition. 1 minute for
Yeah, on the question on the roads.
Amir. On the price tag for
Price tag for the proposed new roads. All right, quickly. So first, I agree with the price tag comment, and that's there. However, we have a detailed study from one of the leading firms who's involved in agriculture, and actually they crunched the numbers on that. So 5 crops, 6 cash crops for 5 years. So if you look at the numbers, if I just give you the total, in 5 years, 4.2 billion. That's the cost. The revenue is 33 billion. So the upside is huge, and it justifies any investment that will basically connect those agri zones to international and regional markets.
So again, me between you and lunch will be shorter. And so I won't speak for long because now I'm eating away your lunch. So why don't we take half an hour for lunch, and we can bring it back here. But I want to answer Abla and very quickly, and Samir. I think the key similarity, of course, between Lebanon and Sudan is that they both defaulted on their debt, which is why they're on the same session. And the key similarity between the two papers is that some of the authors, are hoping to be part of a future government. So in a way, it presents their plans. And the Sudan paper has the whole cabinet represented. We only have a couple of positions we're hoping to get from our paper. Now, there is a section on growth that actually argues that Lebanon has had periods in its past where it was productive, and it can be productive again. It doesn't have to be a rentier society. And it presents also a vision of growth built on the comparative advantages of the country which it analyzes. So there's a section on that. And then there's a section on recovery. Now, there is a key difference. I mean, in our paper, like in other papers, we have to think of what do we do with politicians? I mean, they drive the economy, right? And yet we have to speak about the economy. So the choice we've made is that when we talk about the past, we try to have a bit of political economy analysis of why things turned out to be a certain way. But when we talk about the future, we decided we will talk about economic efficiency. This is the best that could happen, in our opinion, hoping that this would actually influence or stimulate people and parties to push politicians to do the right thing, as opposed to try to guess what this Byzantine system would try to do, right? And there, we talk about stabilization, distributing the losses, but a bit like, I mean, there's been a lot of literature on how to do that. The question is, how to recreate a financial system. It will have to be much smaller, but you have to distribute the losses. But then the new emphasis of the paper is on the state, how to rebuild the state, given that's from a very low base. And here we end up kind of recommending a donor strategy that is a bit different from what exists today, which is one that operates on 2 legs. The donor strategy in Lebanon is interesting. It's kind of, it's conditional. It's a big push, the promise of a big push conditional on big changes. And I think many Lebanese support that at this stage. But we're proposing to complement that with another leg, which is to ensure basic services so that the place doesn't collapse. I mean, now a whole generation of kids cannot even go to school because teachers are paid $10 a month. And so to have that, and we try to defend this by saying, it's not going to create a moral hazard. A population that's in better shape can actually mount a better opposition and the like. So this is a kind of controversial part of the proposal. And so basically to reduce the state deficit and gives a bit more space for the state to rebuild its fiscal power.